Hi folks. Today I want to talk with you about method sections in APA style papers. These are where all the nuts and bolts of your study design end up. And so they're really important so that readers can understand what you did, why you made those choices, and if they're so inclined, they could try to replicate what you did in their own study. So we're going to talk about what's in a method section, some issues around organization, and a little bit of APA formatting along the way. So first of all, what's in it? Well, for studies like yours, you are generally going to have three subsections. One of those is going to be participants, one is going to be procedure, and one is going to be either measures or materials. Generally, if you're doing a survey study where you don't have any manipulations or any physical materials or any stimuli, then you're going to say measures. If you have anything else, you're going to say materials, because a measure is a type of material. So you always want to go with the broadest heading that makes sense. You're always going to start with participants, at least for studies of the type you're doing. Whether you then go to procedure or materials is going to depend on your preference as a writer and the nature of your design. Sometimes the materials don't make sense until people understand your procedure. Other times the procedure doesn't make sense until people understand your materials. So you have to use good judgment there. And sometimes you try it out one way and then it doesn't work. And so you change it. That's fine. You just have to try. Now, these sections are each going to be set off by their own heading. So you need to explore the levels of headings in the APA manual. So your heading for the section method, and it's method singular, not plural, because one study is one method. That's going to be what's called a level 1 heading. Then your subsections, participants, procedure, and materials, are going to be level 2 headings. And then if you have any further subheadings, for instance, in materials, you might have a separate heading for each measure that you use. Then you would use level 3 headings. You probably won't use more than that, but there are more options. I think they go up to level 5 or 6 in the current version of the manual. So we've got our participants. For studies like yours, that's probably going to be one paragraph. In that, you're going to give your sample size, you're going to talk through the demographic nature of your sample. So you're going to report sample size and percentages for the different categories. These are usually identity variables, so things like race or class year. But sometimes they are continuous variables like age, in which case you're going to report mean, standard deviation, and range. You might also, in this section, talk about any restrictions you had on who could participate. So if your study was only open to women aged 18 to 25, you'll say that, because otherwise it's going to look strange that you only have a sample of young women. What you're not going to include here, though, is recruitment. Some journals do want participant recruitment in the participant section rather than the procedure section, but it is more appropriately grouped in procedure because it is part of how you are carrying out your study rather than who is in your study. So I'm going to ask that it goes in your procedure section. So let's talk about that section next. In your procedure, you're going to talk about everything that goes on in your study from recruitment through debriefing. So how do your participants learn about the study? What do they think it's about? How are they completing the study? In this case, this semester, it's all going to be through an anonymous Qualtrics survey. If you have a manipulation, you have to explain what that manipulation or manipulations are. This is often where you'll report your sample size by experimental condition. You will talk about the order that they encounter things in. And you'll talk about anything that's particularly unique about your consent or debriefing procedures. If it's fairly straightforward, you generally just say, then participants read an online debriefing and exited the study. But you might have something more complex, in which case you talk about that there. So that brings us to the most variable section, and that's the measures and materials. And for ease of language, I'm just going to say materials for the rest of this video. You obviously need to talk about what your materials are. People need to read enough that they can either go and find it themselves if it's an existing source, like a particular scale, or can understand what you did well enough to recreate something very, very similar on their own. If you're using existing materials, then you'll cite that source, give information about why you chose that, what it's measuring, or why that manipulation is appropriate, why those materials help you achieve the effect you're looking for, that type of thing. Sometimes we aren't able to use the exact original materials, so we might adapt them. We might take inspiration from what people have done before, but change them a little bit, or use, let's say we're using images, we might use a different set of images that are updated for the hairstyles and clothing that's popular today rather than in 1950. If you adapt anything, you have to explain how. If you create your own materials, you need to explain why and how you made the decisions of those. It can't just be, well, this is what I could get my hands on. You have to have good logic behind the choices you made. You're always going to cite your sources. So if it's an existing measure or materials that you've drawn from a pre-existing study, so for example, a word list or a particular set of images that you show people, or a video clip that prior research has shown to be effective at inducing sadness or happiness, you need to cite that original source. Not just anyone that's used it, but track it back to the original source. For measures, we give a sample item, we give the response scale, we give the reliability information, we give Chromebox Alpha from the original study as well as Chromebox Alpha from our study. Sometimes you'll talk about validity. I will say that this varies hugely by journal. I don't tend to make a big deal out of it because honestly, not all measures have great validity data out there. That's only true if it went through a formal scale development process. So I don't make a big deal out of validity, but with other instructors, it might be more of an issue. So just be aware of that. Let's see what I'm missing. Okay. In the APA style samples that I have available to you, I have examples of detailed descriptions of measures. One for a measure that is one single scale, and one for a measure that is comprised of a number of subscales. So you can see how people talk about measures, the level of detail that's needed. One of the most common pieces of feedback I give on first draft of method sections is that you need more information. That said, there are some things you can't include until your study's done. So you won't know your exact sample size. You won't know the exact percentage of people who identify as men or Black or juniors. But you can put placeholders in. My placeholder tends to be XX because a double X doesn't occur all that often in English, so I can easily do a search on XX and then replace it with the actual numbers. You can use something else. I've seen other people use particular symbols. That's your preference, but make sure you're indicating that you understand what does need to go in your method section, even if you don't have the numbers yet. Similarly, you can have the Chromebox Alpha from the original study of a given measure, but you won't have the Chromebox Alpha from your study yet because you don't have your data. But that doesn't mean you can't include a placeholder there. You obviously can't write your method section until you know what all is going to be involved in your study. But you also can't write your IRB proposal until you know what's involved in your study. And this is all information that needs to be in your IRB proposal as well. That said, do not just paste your method section into an IRB proposal, or paste the information about your study from your IRB proposal into your method section. They are written in different formats, and they're organized differently because they are serving different goals. A final thing I want to mention is that this is one of the pieces of writing that you can do collaboratively with your group mates. You don't have to, but most groups do opt to write this collaboratively. If you are going to write individually, you do need to let me know that in advance of the due date so I can make some adjustments on the back end of how I have things set up in Canvas. The reason why I allow this portion to be written collaboratively in methods is that there's a formulaic nature to how we write a method section. And when you're learning that formula, it's really hard to deviate much from it. You're going to have very similar language. So even if you are writing individually, you're going to end up with very similar products. So it's easier for me to give feedback to you collectively, and honestly, it's easier for you because it lets you really focus on learning the system. When I teach seminar, however, everyone writes their own, because by then you know the pattern, you know the system, and then you can start to make it your own and play with that language a little bit and make some different stylistic choices. So that's it for now. I may have individual things that I talk to you and or your group about as you draft and then subsequently revise your method section. For example, I've had some groups where I talk with them about the need to include an appendix with sample materials, particularly if they're visual images, so that as a reader, I can understand what's being discussed. Maybe you need a table, maybe you need figures. There's all kinds of things that might be in a method section. But this gets you started, and then we can deal with refinements on a case-by-case basis.